Hi there, we're going to spend the next few minutes creating a tire burnout on this vehicle. So we're going to do this by using minus fluid effects. And in this demo, we're just going to be focusing in on the rear tire here. We're going to emit some fluid from a fluid container, or inside a fluid container, and the car is going to go along the path of the road here and continuously have that burnout occurring, or the fluid emitting from the tire. Just very quickly, spend a few seconds here talking about the setup. I have the car animated already. Nothing special, it's just keyframed animation on the rotation of the tire. It's grouped, as you can see here. So I just have this animated. You can see the keyframes. There's many ways I could have done this. Some people would probably choose to go through an expression as well. For the demo, I thought to control the speed and so on, I thought it would just look better if I manually keyed it. And that's what I've done. So it starts off very slow, and sorry, not starts off very slow. It starts off with a static vehicle, and then eventually the vehicle goes. And towards the end of the animation, I actually slow down the rotation of the tire till it comes to a complete stop. Okay, and that's just to simulate the look and feel of a small little burnout. All right. So the next thing, if I actually just go in on the tire here a bit, I've actually separated this out in a few key ways. For the most part, when you have a tire, many people probably have this, the sidewall and the flat area of the tire as one single mesh. I decided to break it out just to make it easier for myself to emit a fluid, use the fluid as an emitter. So I'm going to emit from surface, and that's key, and I'll get into that when I start working with the fluid or with the emitter. And then I just have the wheel as well. Alright, let's go in here. First things first, we're going to create a fluid container without the emitter. So in your effects module, go to fluids, create 3D container, and let's make sure no emitter is created with it because we're going to add it later on. So we're just going to hit apply and close. And what I want to do here is more or less put the bottom of the container sort of aligned with the road. Okay. Ideally, when we're going to set up this container later on, when we set up some boundaries, that's almost going to it's almost going to act like our collision as well in there. Although we are going to make the road collision and as well as the vehicle. So if I hit play right now, not much is going to occur except for that. Everything's pretty much where it should be. Next thing I need to do now is create an emitter. In this case, what we want to do is emit from a surface. If I go in there and just add an emitter, it's just going to create a point inside this container. In this case, to simulate a realistic burnout, I want to emit from the surface of this tire. So I'm just going to go select that surface, go into fluids, and add edit content, and then emit from object. We'll just, when we say emit from object, we're going to make sure we select surface. Everything's going to go to default, no worries. We're going to go in there and change those settings anyways. And it doesn't, oh, of course. How can I forget? You need to shift select your fluid. So select the object, shift select your fluid, hit apply close, and now it's not going to look pretty, but we should now start seeing some fluid emit. There we go. Now there's a couple of things that are going on incorrectly here. First of all, let me just select my camera here and just clean this out. Please ignore this. It's just I have an animation on that, so it always jumps to that spot. So we see that we have some fluid, however, it's basically in the same spot. So there's a couple of ways we can resolve this. We can either parent the fluid container to the body. However, that might not work for us. What we will want to do is set an auto resize on this container. And we'll be doing that in a sec. For right now, let's just go back to this emitter now. And let's look at the settings in the attribute editor. And we're going to change some of this to control its basically rate emission and so on. So first thing we need to do is go to the basic attributes. I'm going to set this percentage to about 400. And if I play this back, you can see it's just going to be a thicker cloud. emitting more particles into the container. Next thing we want to do is control some of the velocity, or how the motion of the fluid inherits velocity. So what we want to do is go to the speed attributes here. We want to go to replace. I'm going to say 0.4. Now these are all numbers. These are what I used, and through this entire demo, it's going to be what fit for this particular scene. All these settings obviously will look different if you're applying this to a larger vehicle. Let's say I'm working with a very small scale vehicle, so if you did have a real world size vehicle, some of these values would probably be increased or decreased depending on the look you're looking for. So inherit velocity 0.4, I'm going to just set the normal speed down to 0. There are other options down here, such as directional speed, so it can actually set, as the tire spinning, it'll inherit a certain velocity in a certain direction. You could bring that up to 10-ish and start controlling. We don't want X, we really want Z, because we want all the fluid to push along its Z axis. I didn't do any of that. I seem to be getting a good movement or good simulation in the fluid with just some of these settings. So I'm going to leave it as 0 for now. If we need to go in there later, we will. And next thing we want to do is go into the fluid container, and I mentioned auto resize, so we're going to jump into that one in a second again. Next thing we need to do is set some base attributes for the fluid container. Now we have the base resolution. Obviously, this is the resolution of your container. So as you increase this, you're also going to decrease your performance, your render times, and so on. So the suggestion is usually to start low, slowly increase some of the details so you can start fine-tuning some of that stuff. For this case, I think a 30 should do. I'll leave the size of the container to a 10 by 10 by 10. Just a little, I guess one of those other warning things in general, you don't want to scale up your container. You want to use the size here because these two are related to each other. You want to increase the size of the container using these attributes versus the scaling of the transformation of the container. Okay. Next thing, we're going to look at some of the boundaries we're going to set here. So as the fluid emits into, or is pushed around this container, we want certain areas for the container just to, the fluid just to go through, and other areas we want to act as a boundary wall. So the only one we're really worried about is this bottom one here, so negative y, and that's essentially the only one we're going to set to have a boundary. So negative y, and these we're going to set to none. So x and z to none, and minus y on the boundary y. I'm not sure if we're going to get much if we play back still. But you see what's happening with the fluid is sort of just vanishes off the container. It doesn't bounce around inside the container, and that's fine. That's what we're looking for in this case. We're going to scroll now down to the auto resize. We're going to jump into some of this dynamic simulation stuff in a second. Oh, sorry, content details, not dynamic simulation. So we're going to enable the auto resize. We're going to set a max resolution of 300 to this. And if we play that back, you see all of a sudden everything's just exploded in all different directions, which is really good. We're starting to get what we want. We're actually starting to see the container move along with for the ride, so it's going with the emission of the tire, which is great. However, this explosion is occurring because we haven't set any collisions in here. So what would be one collision is going to be obviously the car body, and another collision will be the road here. So we need to select the container, select the car body, and we're going to go to fluids. We're going to say make collide. That's one of them. We're going to do this the same for the road. I need to go to my channel box because I have this in as a reference, and we're going to say fluids make collide. You can almost do it with the rim itself. It's probably not a bad idea. So I'm going to do that as well. and may collide. And if I play this back now, it's going to look a lot different from what it did a second ago. So we don't have this no longer exploding all over the place. Just frame the vehicle. It's actually going around the entire vehicle. So we're like 50% of the way there with the look and feel, just by adding some collisions. Okay. We're going to go back to our auto resize attribute for the fluid. So let's make sure we select our fluid here. And we're going to make sure a couple of other things are turned on and mess around with some of these parameters. So the resize substeps, this is something if you're dealing with very fast moving fluids like we are right now. We have the tire pushing out some smoke very quickly, and we need that substepping in the resizing. So as the container resizes, we want it to be measured in between frames as well. So I highly recommend turning it on for something like this. For many simulations, if they're not moving very quickly, you would just leave this disabled. Obviously, this is extra calculation that's happening, so it does increase or decrease performance, increase render times, and so on. Next thing I'm going to do is look at the threshold, and then the auto resize margin. The threshold essentially controls the threshold between the fluid density and the resizing of the container. So as if the density is really thick, it's going to start resizing itself. As it dissipates, the box will start collapsing in on itself. Obviously, with the auto resizing, what we're trying to eliminate here is creating very large containers, which obviously are very bad for playback performance in your scene. So the auto resizing tool is something you really want to use for large type of simulations like this. So in this case, we can mess around. If I set something like a 2, just as an example, you'll see what starts happening here is we don't resize at all. So we basically told we set this threshold too high that the box is essentially not resizing itself due to the density not being strong enough. So if we bring this down to, I found that I had a 0.1 there for, I think that's the default, but even a 0.05 we seem to be fairly decent. You'll know that it's not working very well because as the fluid hits these walls of the container, it'll start creating a flat area here. This one actually seems to be working really well, so we'll leave it as is. Then we have the auto resize margin. This creates essentially extra voxels between the last part of the fluid here and where the wall of the container will be. So the larger, right now it's 0, so it's going to keep it as closely or as tight as possible to that fluid emission. If we set something like 5, it's going to set a space in between that, so it's going to be a larger gap at all times. Having a little space is not a bad thing. It will change your fluid a little bit sometimes because you are giving that extra space. So you can see with our fluid, we have it puffing out to the side here right at the beginning. We could fix that with some of the other attributes we're going to change later on and what we're going to add. So if we set this to 1, just play that back, see where you're going. Generally change a couple of attributes, hit play, see if things are looking better, and go from there. So I think we're pretty good with our auto resize, and we're going to move down to our content details. I mentioned dynamic simulation, but we're not touching that for this demo. So we're really just going to focus on density. So first thing we're going to do is control the density of the actual fluid, and I'm going to leave this at 0.5, which is the default. Buoyancy is something I'm going to bring up to 5. So buoyancy is obviously how fast the fluid rises. As dissipation controls how fast the fluid dissipates in the air. This is another value they're going to have to set. That all depends on your simulation. For this, I set it at 1.5, more or less. It'll still run for quite a while here. If you set it too high, it'll disappear very quickly. So here's what we're getting right now, and you can see that auto resize occur. You can see it's actually because that density is so low, the boxes maybe, or sorry, the containers collapsing maybe too quickly. This is maybe where we want to go back to the auto resizing and maybe adjust this and see what we get here. And so you see the simulation's a little bit slower now, but it's actually looking a lot better. Let's see if it collapses too quickly on us. No, it's looking really good. Perfect. It doesn't collapse till it really disappears. Alright, so we'll leave it as like so. There's really not much here to mess around with anymore. I think we're pretty much done on content details. What we can do now is go into the velocity area and just control the swirling. So as the fluid moves along its container, it just controls the swirl. You control the strength on that, and what I did is set it to 1 for my test and hit play, and you can see what we're getting here. Looking pretty good. Now the other thing we can jump to now is shading, because we can see what's happening in the viewport. Everything looks very flat, just white. There's no detail to it. It looks really great when you start controlling things like the shading and lighting. I'm going to jump to lighting first, just to turn on self shadows. That's probably the easiest here. So self shadowing is turned on. You can control its shadow opacity and even diffusion for those shadows. You could turn on what type of lights you want to shine into this, and obviously you can also use your real lights as well. So when you have real lights on, it's going to use the or your directional lights in your scene to do that. So one thing to be careful is when you're using real lights and shadows. If all your lights have ray tracing, it's going to really slow down your renders. So be very, very careful. And if you do need ray trace on more than one light, I guess the easiest option to get around that would be to light links to control that light and make sure it's only affected on that fluid. Real lights, I would just disable it if you're not using your real lights, so using just the internal system here. Alright. It works really well. The only problem is with like shadows and so on. When it comes to rendering, if I turn off real lights, you're not going to get shadows on surfaces. You're going to get just self-contained shadows within the fluid itself. Okay, so real lights, if you need shadows everywhere, turn them off. If you don't, turning them on, there's a render hit to you, but obviously it's going to look a lot better. So I'm going to take a look at the shading quality here, in particular the quality attribute. This has a direct effect on your render times. So as you increase this value, there's going to be more sampling occurring on each fluid or each voxel here, and obviously what you want to try to do is find a middle ground here. If you set it too low, you're going to get a lot of noise in your renders. You're going to get like all these little blotchy stuff, these gradient look in your fluids, which is what you don't want. So the suggestion is here to do a couple of renders as it is right now, and find, increase the value or decrease it until you start seeing noise or don't start seeing noise. So 1 is the default. I usually go down to a 0.5, hit render a couple of times and see what I get. If I see noise at 0.5, I increase it to 0.6 to another render, to the point I don't find that noise inside my render anymore. Just leave it as it is, and then leave it at that point. Your render times can increase twofold, going from 0.5 to like 0.6. Obviously that depends on the size of your fluid that you're rendering at that time for that frame. For sampling method, I leave depth of jitter here. I don't really touch anything else unless you really have to. And for this demo, the last part I'll touch, sorry, not for this demo, but for at least this fluid container, I jumped around a little bit. I'm going to go to shading, and the most important one here that I'm going to mess around is with transparency, and I'm almost going to set this like to a solid color, almost black, not quite, but close there. There's obviously other options you can have here. Drop off, I might set to 0. If you set a cube drop off, you'll see as the fluid reaches the edges. If you have a cube or a sphere, you have different options here. You'll see the shape of the fluid drop off inside of that container. So I set it to off. You might not even need to do that and just leave it as the default. You can change the color of your fluid if you wish. There's a bunch of other parameters here that I didn't touch, but in some cases, some users might want to touch things like opacity, just to show you what happens here in the viewport here for you. Just do that. So you can see what starts happening when you start controlling opacity of that fluid. Very slight changes will change the container drastically. With that done, we're going to go back to the emitter. We need to change a few things here, so I'm just going to focus in on this. Let's turn around here. So the fluid emitter in the attribute, there's a few things. It's probably hard to tell in this particular example. Let me just quickly play. Yeah, it's hard to tell, but what tends to happen is the fluid's being emitted from everywhere on that particular surface based on its UV. So what happens is that's part of the reason why I split it up, because I didn't want fluid to emit from the sidewall. But for those people that do have it, the sidewall and the flat surface as one big tire, you can essentially map a ramp to this to control the area that you want an emission to occur. And I'm going to show you that here. And even though it doesn't look like it might be totally necessary, just show you the process of doing that. So back in your container, what you want to do is go to your fluid attributes here and density emission map. I'm going to map a ramp to this. So just click on the map button and put a ramp. What we need to do is change the interpolation here from linear to none. And I'm just going to change some parameters here just to see what we get. So, oops, let's remove that. And let's see if we can actually just view something for the demo here. Just play this back. Okay, it doesn't show very well. Maybe I can change this to a U ramp. Okay, we actually see the problem here. Alright, so notice where the fluid, let's see, I'll try to stop it in that area again. You'll notice where the fluid's being emitted, it seems to be only from one area of that surface, so you see that density just going around with the tire the whole time. Just watch it spin, you'll see that there it is going again. So that's because we just switched the ramp to be a U versus a V. So if I go back to my emitter here and go to my ramp, so we want to make sure we're along the V of your UVs. So we go to V ramp, and that way it's going to be, you can see your sample here. If you actually select your surface, go to your UV editor. You can see what we have here. Here's the actual tire. So to shell, you have soft selection turned on here. Let me turn it off. So we can change this a bit if we have to. Or I mean, if we want to make it, I guess, along the U, we could do that as well. Let's do that for demo. Move it here to the side. And we'll close that off. And now what you'll see is what we were getting with the U before, we're now going to get it with the V. So there it is. It's in one little spot. It's emitting a lot more fluid. So back into the ramp, and we're going to make sure this is on U. We're essentially going to put the white area right where we think that those UVs are, and almost at the middle of the tire is essentially where we're going to be emitting from. So I can even thin that out a bit more if need be. And I think that might pretty much do it. There we go. Alright, perfect. Here we are. You can see that there's no emission occurring from here until the middle of the tire. And that's just a preference. You can choose what you want to do there. Now what's left to complete the look of the burnout, there's many things you could probably do. There's motion fields you can add to the tire, but what I chose to do is a volume axis field, which I place back at the tire here to push the fluid through as it reaches that area like a vortex, and it just gave a nice look that I was looking for. So just select the fluid container. We'll go to fields here and we'll add a volume axis field. I'll just leave it as default. It's a cube. What we want to do is change it. Obviously we don't want that. So in the attribute editor for that, we're going to change its shape from, where is it? Right here, volume control attributes, from a cube to a cylinder, like so. And then the other thing we want to do is sort of figure out which way this is actually pushing. I think it's that way. What we want to do is rotate it, like so. We're going to place it, make sure you don't go through the ground, but place it somewhere behind the tire where the fluid's coming out of. Just like so. I'm going to change its magnitude to 20. Attenuation to 0.3. And then use max distance to obviously control how far this axis field's actually controlling the fluid. Now we're going to set this to 0.5. We're going to hit play, see what we get here. We can scale this up as well if we need to. I should, oh, yeah, this is a problem. So what I should do is I should position that again. And let's see if parenting works to the vehicle. Yes, it does, and it's not doing exactly what I want here. Alright, change some of these settings here to long axis 3, this to 5. There we go. Now we're starting to, here's my little arrow to help me. Let's see if this pushes it along a bit more. There we go, sucks it up a bit more, it looks like. Creates this like little puffy cloud, which is great. Just show the difference. If you bring down the magnitude, you'll see that that stuff is not going to be occurring as much. Okay, start over, crank up the magnitude. I put it to 50 this time just to show it pushing through there. Alright, if we have to, we can bring this down a bit more. There we go. Alright, so we got essentially what we want for the most part. You can always go in there and control things like your look and feel for the shading to see if you can get a bit more out of that. But more or less, I think this is essentially where you're going to get. So if you hit play here, you can see it goes back. Now the car moves forward and continues emitting. The only thing that's really probably left in this case and I didn't set is maybe setting some keyframes on the rates for the emitter, so I can emit nothing, then have this big strong push, and then maybe bring it down again for both the emitter to control the rate there. We could do the same thing on the volume axis field, control the magnitude of it, maybe not have as much effect as it goes along. the riser along the road, and then we can also control the rate as it stops to no longer emit any particles or any fluid at all. And that should pretty much cover the basic of the demo. And then after, when you actually get the settings that you want, we can also do is just do a quick play blast, do a render. Actually, even before that, maybe cache all the data by selecting the fluid. And then I have here what this looked like after I did a render. So here we have it, a little more detailed, a little more refined. This is in the scene files that were provided, so you can see what that looks like. And that this demo, I mean, it's supposed to cover, get you about 99% of the way there. After this, it should be more just refining and tweaking until you get the look that you're comfortable with.